Hello? All right. Hi everybody, my name is not sure why I'm not working. Hi everybody, my name is Corey.
Put it on your shirt.
Hello? 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 Good? Yay. All right, that was embarrassing. My name is Corey Pronman. I've been an NHL writer at ESPN for the last 4 years, focusing on the NHL draft and NHL prospects through a variety of means, scouting, statistical evaluation, and other methods. And I'm here to talk to you today about 3 topics from my research. The first thing is something I call the late birth date effect. The second is talking about the role of luck in the NHL draft. And the third topic will be discussing the merits of statisticians versus scouts at the NHL draft table. Let's get to the first one, which is what I call the late birth date effect. What does that mean? Well, the NHL draft has this very weird rule relative to the other leagues, where if you were born after September 15th, your draft year gets pushed back a year. So what that means is, so for example, the 2017 draft, the first year eligible players are players born in 1999 and players born after September 15th in 1998. While this may not seem like a huge deal on its face, it can actually have quite significant impact on the NHL draft, where you have players who are sometimes 4, 6, 8 months apart, sometimes even nearly a year apart in terms of how old they are, trying to be evaluated together as a group. So the names that I'm listing right here are some examples of players who have been late birthdays, and you'll see them, their draft year has been pushed back a year. So why I think this is interesting is I had a theory that this late birthday issue was impacting the NHL draft. Meaning that I felt like these older, more experienced players, because they have a full NHL season of play, they are older than some of the other players being drafted in 1999 this year, for example, were being drafted too high because they were, for example, just producing more because they were in turn older. So I wanted to test this. And how did I do that? I took all players picked for 2 decades, from 1990 to 2010, that were first year eligible, up to the 210th pick, in all leagues and all skater positions. And before someone asked me the question, whether it was skaters or forwards or defensemen or other leagues, the results were always the same. And I split this group up into 2, late birth date and non-late birth date prospects. And then I would look at how each of these slots produced for these 2 groups over the 20 years in the National Hockey League. And I compared each slot to each other. There were like 10 or 15 slots that weren't the same, so I took those out as a data set. But for the most part, there was plenty there to go at. And what I found is that the non-late birthday players represented by the blue trend line were, despite being picked around the same slot as their younger colleagues, were actually performing much worse in the National Hockey League. And in fact, this effect got emphasized in the second half of the draft, where you often see players who are older that are actually not really NHL prospects whatsoever, but they're being drafted ahead of superior prospects, partly because they're actually producing, whereas these other prospects probably only get like 20, 30 points in the CHL, but they are actually better players. And while this might, like I said before, be a minor adjustment, it seems that NHL teams over a long period of time have not made this adjustment. We are seeing older players consistently, year after year, get overdrafted, and teams are losing a ton of production by not simply making this simple minor adjustment. And next, just kind of show this, I want to show how this breaks down by month, not just non-late birthday and late birthday. So what I did is to find a kind of a uniform pool of talent. I took every CHL forward pick in that 20-year span, that was first year eligible, and had it play a specific amount of games and produce a certain amount of points in the Canadian Hockey League. And I found this is how they produced in the National Hockey League. As you can see, despite the fact that they had similar production in the Canadian Hockey League, that month of when they were born has a giant impact on how much they're going to produce in the NHL. You see players that can produce sometimes 2 to 3 times as much in terms of their point production, even though they produce the exact same amount in the Canadian Hockey League, if you do not make that tweak in your evaluation. And now I just want to put it by way of example. I've picked 3 players here who are currently in the CHL. And I want to point you directly to player A right now. That one I find is interesting because if you look at what I call his draft -1 season, which is a popular term used, I find, a lot in online discourse to discuss what a player's season is before he was drafted. And the draft +1 is often used to describe the season after he was drafted. This could potentially be a misleading terminology right here, because you can quickly see what the issue is here. Is that this player might seem to have an impressive draft resume. His draft season was pretty good, a little bit worse, but still pretty good. And his draft -1 season, he was very good. So maybe you say, oh, it's a sample size issue, maybe he got hurt, his team got worse. But overall, this player A looks really impressive. But when you compare him to player C, and you make that birthday adjustment, he doesn't look so impressive anymore. He's still very good, but you can see that maybe player C might be as desirable. Because when they were at the same point in time in terms of age, they were producing roughly the same amount. Now, if anybody has guessed who these players are, they can don't shout out, but this are the players I'm talking about. Player A is the projected first overall pick, Nolan Patrick. Player B is the third overall pick last year, Pierre Dubois. And player C is Nick Suzuki. Some people who are very in tune to prospect might know who Nick Suzuki is. Probably most of the room has no idea who he is. He's projected to go somewhere being picked 20th overall. But if you make that birthday adjustment for Nick Suzuki and look at what his season was as a 16-year-old, rather than just simply call it a draft -1, I prefer the term 16, 17, 18-year-old season. Statistically, he lines up with Nolan Patrick very well. Now, I'm not saying I would pick Nolan Patrick over Nick Suzuki, but what I'm saying is I think they would be a lot closer statistically than maybe some people in this room might have been led to believe before they stepped in here. So here's what I think you should take away in terms on this topic, is that when I'm looking at a player's statistics, the very first thing I look at, before I look at points or games played, what league they are, I look at birth month. Because without knowing a player's birth month, all context on their performance is lost. It is a minor detail, but it's significantly important. And I find that this adjustment is not made enough, and it should be. Moving to the next topic I want to talk to you about, which is drafting skill and the role of luck in the NHL draft. Obviously, everyone here knows that drafting is very important. You look at NHL rosters, a huge bulk of teams' rosters are built through the draft. Teams spend millions of dollars each year on scouting. And given how important it is, I want to ask two questions. One, what is the consistency that teams have? Can teams consistently draft well or sometimes draft poorly? And the next one I want to ask is, how much does luck really affect team draft results? So to answer the first question, this is how I set it up. I took every pick from 1 to 210 for that same 20-year span, and I assigned it an expected value based on games played. Whether it was games played or points, the results were the same. And I looked at every team's pick in the NHL over that 20-year span, and I saw whether they were above or below what was expected. So here's an example. Scott Gomez was top 10 for the 1998 class in games played. He was picked 27th overall, and thus he had a 2 times value multiplier from what he was usually expected to do. I'm putting on the next part, I'm going to give a little credit to Neil Payne of 538. He did something similar, not completely similar, for the NFL draft. So using this data, I then looked team by team to see what was their consistency in finding either surplus or deficient value in the NHL draft. So here is, by way of example, the Minnesota-Dallas franchise. And here's how you should read this chart. If you performed well in the draft in a year, you would go and then perform well again the year after that. You will have a data point represented in the upper right quadrant. If you perform poorly in year 1 and then poorly again in year 2, you'll have a data point represented in the lower left quadrant. If there was consistency in your drafting record, you'll be in the upper right quadrant and the lower left quadrant a lot, whether or not the consistency was in a positive or negative way. And Dallas, I found, was actually probably one of the more consistent franchises in drafting out of all of them. And you can look up on HockeyDB if you want to check my work and whether or not you believe this or not. But as you can see, they're mostly populated in the upper right quadrant. But one of the reasons why I wanted to do this is I wanted to test a theory that everybody puts out there, that Detroit are these genius drafters that year after year find these stars in the late rounds and are brilliant in the draft. And I found that's not really the case. While Detroit actually has obviously some many very good European picks, I don't have to list them all, I'm sure many people here know who they are. If you look at their drafts as a whole, it isn't really as impressive. Even the Datsyuk draft, if you look at what their Datsyuk draft was as a whole, they had many high picks who they got little to no return on, and the value on that draft was actually a slight negative. If you look at the upper left quadrant, that data point up there, the DATSU draft represented by year 1, and the Zetterberg draft, which was a very positive draft, was represented by year 2. But in general, Detroit really showed no consistency when I looked at it in terms of their drafting. And these are my way of examples. I think the main question I wanted to ask is, does the NHL teams as a whole show consistency in the NHL draft table? Can you tell whether a team is consistently good or consistently bad? And the answer was no. Over 20 years span, the NHL scouts showed no consistency year to year in terms of being good or bad. And I thought this was really important because I see so often in public discussion or even in private discussion among NHL teams praising a certain draft class, praising or criticizing a certain pick. And that's bad analysis right there, because it's even now if you go to the process of why that was a good or bad pick, that's different. But results can be very misleading because there is so much randomness in the draft that going after individual picks in draft classes does not add up with the evidence, because we have, 5 picks, 6 picks. There's way too much randomness in the draft. Which leads me to my next topic on how much does luck really affect the NHL draft? And this was on a year-to-year basis. I wanted to see if we extended it to 10 years, 20 years, can we find that there's skill in the NHL draft? And so what I did is took some of the very same data I used before with the expected value points. Andrew Thomas, who then helped me do this with War on Ice, now he's with Minnesota Wild, helped me out a little bit here. Then I took all the value every team got from all their draft picks. I found the difference between that and what was expected. And then I had to incorporate the variance that might be in their team's picks, because if you're picking at the top of the draft, for example, the variance in results is a little bit bigger than if you're picking at the bottom. That's just from the nature of the data. And then I got a normalized draft score showing what a team improved or not improved over their expected performance in the NHL draft. I call this my draft score, and here are the results. The results aren't as important as what I'm going to say next, but this is just by way of example to show you how teams performed over those 2-decade span relative to where they were expected to perform at their draft picks. You can look at it now and decide whether or not it passes the smell test or not. But what is important is that there is supposed to be a certain amount of variance here that's normal, but there was deviations from that variance that suggest skill. It should have been a variance of 1 for that normalized score, but instead here was 1.33, which means that at least in this test case, that I observed that at least that 25% of draft results are due to the team's skill, but the other 75% of draft results are due just to pure randomness. And I feel like that's a very important takeaway, just so we always have draft analysis in proper context. That is not too conclusory when we're talking about the NHL draft. Because there is so much randomness in these results in terms of trying to project 17-year-olds and how they're going to do when they're 22, 23, that I think is important to understand this. And the last thing I want to talk to you guys about today is a very simple test I did. I wanted to kind of line up scouts and statisticians and see how they did the NHL draft. It's a very simple experiment. How I did this, I took every CHL forward drafted from those 2 decades and I assigned them a rank. The scout rank was purely just where they were picked. Now I feel like someone can argue that's wrong because scouts do look at stats too, but I'm just going to pretend that's not true for a second. And the stat rank, which was a really, really, really dumb way of doing this, dumb and just in terms of simple, was just looking at who had the most points. So you had a scout rank and a stat rank. I'm aware the stat rank can be much more convoluted, points per game, team strength, all teammate factors, so on and so forth. But I want it to be very, very simple. So for example, Brandon Dubinsky got a 12 rank on terms of scout because he was the 12th CHL forward pick in 2004. But among that eligible group of players, he had the second most points, so he had a stat rank of 2. And of course, he was second among eligible players in NHL scoring from that group. And what I did is basically I saw what the correlation between those 2 ranks were in actual results. In total, the results were closely the same. The stats did a little bit better of a job in terms of finding NHL players, finding the stars. The scouts did a little bit better in finding the busts. But that's not really important. This has been done before. We've seen all kinds of analysts do this before. I was curious to see, though, there was an ideal weighting to see if there's a way to improve these results by combining these 2 schools of thought. And I found that if you just took a simple average of the 2 ranks, the results improved pretty significantly. We saw pretty much the predictions on finding who the busts were and who the stars were were improved by a significant margin if you just took an average of what the scouts and the stats think. And I think that's a very important conclusion. Now, the ideal weight was actually about 55% scouts, 55% stats, 45% scouts, so it makes people in this room feel better. But I think in general, what's important to take away from this is that both schools of thought can work together to help achieve better results. And what's really important, I think, is to know that the scout rank and the stat rank don't really correlate. Despite the fact that they found similar results, they were doing it by picking different players. And that's why I think when you average the two ranks together, you found much improved success in your draft results. And so finally, to wrap this all up, look at a player's birth month. There's a ton of luck in the NHL draft, and that has to be incorporated into all analysis. And scouts and statisticians can benefit each other through proper synergy of their analysis. Questions?
Interesting stuff. Any questions?
Yeah. So, I mean, with that all said, do you think teams should probably reevaluate how they do draft in terms of should they be looking at quantity if they are outside those 10 picks where it's, a lot more predictability in the players? Like, should they be, rather than trading for 1 third-round pick, maybe get 2 fourth-round picks so you can land a Dubinsky potentially and have that quantity so that you possibly see a guy pan out a little bit more?
Well, there are certain value numbers that probably each kind of picks. There's definitely been teams that have value that have developed kind of trade values on certain picks. I think that's all in proper context. One of the issues is when we talk about all that average, when teams try to trade down, because the numbers say they need this will be the best pick in the long run. Well, what if that team has a guy that's available right like 7th overall? How do you balance that? And I think that's something that NHL teams have a really hard time determining, because the stats guys will say on average, these numbers will say we'll get more value. We've seen analytically inclined teams follow that strategy. But then the scouts will push back and say, well, you might be right, but we have this guy ranked 10, so what would happen if this pick was actually the 10th overall pick? I think you see that balance. In general, I think that is the better strategy given the current climate where we don't really have a very progressive community in the NHL scouting department. But I would let you know that there's still pushback on that for the reasons I just stated.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Sorry, do you mind if I jump? So there was a question way back. I believe you mentioned that the scouts are better at identifying busts. And the models are better at finding value. Why do you think that is? And can we train the models to better identify the busts?
I think we've seen, not in hockey, but in other sports, that models have a very hard time with injuries. They have a hard time with guys who are dealing with off-ice issues. And I think those are things that people who are very attuned to players that they can evaluate. I think really if you actually dig into that data, you'll find that I think the biggest reason why stats are doing much better is because they're not really caring about size. There's actually a negative relationship between what the stats predict and how tall a player is. And we've seen that especially for forwards, has no relationship to NHL success among drafted players. Yeah, we still see size be a real significant factor in the NHL draft, despite the fact that all these great players who are small are entering the NHL right now. And I think that's why they're finding so much value at the draft table.
Low Tide says hi, and he still loves you. The one thing that he goes on about a lot in his blog is the funky draft when McTavish traded and got like 4 picks, 5 picks for 1 player. What do you think about that?
I'm sorry. Say that again?
McTavish, when he traded 1 player, got like 4 or 5 picks out of it, and drafted Anik, and Slepyshev is the 1 player that he has in the league. What do you think about that idea? Like just going for total quantity rather than high picks?
Well, that's to be in a proper context because teams do have a contract limit. So if you keep on going after quantity over and over and over again, you're going to have too many good prospects. All of a sudden, you don't have enough contracts to give out. That could be a potential issue. I think what was interesting when he did that is he went after Russian players. He took Anton Slepyshev and Bogdan Yakimov. The latter hasn't worked out. But that was the strategy there, is that he saw that there was value, highly ranked players, teams were going to target, we're going to get multiple of them. And I think in abstract, that's a good strategy. But like I talked about with the previous questioner, there might be situations where your team pushes back against you to not pass up a good opportunity if there's a really great player you guys like a lot. Like for example, when the Flyers traded up to go get Travis Konechny, they really liked him, and so far he's ended up being very good, but they have to Toronto trade it down. You can argue which strategy is better, but clearly there are situations where it might be negative.
Okay, last question?
Do you think that this could be applied at the major junior level, whereas players would be they'd be playing for them for an extra year before they're even eligible for the NHL draft?
Can you repeat that?
Would this be applicable to at the major junior level, where players would be playing for them for 2 or 3 years?
Which part of my presentation?
Of the whole, I guess, theory of it, where players would be playing for the team, for the junior team an extra year before they're eligible for the NHL draft.
Yeah, actually, that's actually something I'm writing about that I'm going to be publishing maybe in about a month or so, that if the draft year got pushed back an extra year, we actually see significantly improved results. We would see improved results in the NHL draft, by about 5 to 10% improved results. I know the late birthday issue, the CHL, is a major debate point around the National Hockey League right now. But I know there's a lot of pushback right now to get players in the CHL for longer, to get more time to see them, for the very reasons I just said and that you pointed out.
Sorry, I was meaning more of would teams be more willing to draft players with a later birth date at 14 or 15?
Yeah, the midget draft.
Yeah, the bantam or midget draft.
I would have to look into that data for CHL teams to know that. I don't want to spitball it and answer it based on a hunch. What we're seeing here is a bias. The reason why I suspect the late birthday issue exists is because these older players are producing more and thus seem like better players. So that these teams are not making these proper adjustments. So it's possible that same logic could apply there, but I would have to look at that data. I don't want to just give you an answer off the top of my head.
Okay, thanks, Troy.
Thank you.